The desert storm swept in like regret, sudden, choking, and without apology. Red dust clawed at the windshield of Rachel Morris's sedan as if trying to erase her from the map. Highway 7, a thin ribbon of asphalt slicing through the emptiness of Arizona, had turned into a corridor of orange haze and shifting shadows. Her car had died without a sound, as if deciding to surrender before she could. Inside the vehicle, Rachel sat motionless. Her hands were folded in her lap, fingers tangled tightly. The air was warm, dry, and thick with silence. Her hazard lights blinked on and off, a soft, helpless rhythm. The kind of light you could imagine blinking forever in the dark, unnoticed. No cell signal. No passing cars. No signs of life except for the wind, which screamed across the desert like an ancient warning. Her eyes stung, not from fear, but from the dust and from holding back a kind of exhaustion that had lived in her chest for years. She glanced at the rearview mirror out of habit, even though there was nothing to see but orange dust tumbling like smoke. Her thermos, long since drained, rolled against the passenger seat. The gas station she passed an hour ago had been her last chance to refill it. She hadn't. She'd been too focused on getting through this stretch of road before sundown. Another mistake. She had made many. She opened the glove box. A few receipts, a pen with no ink, and a torn photograph, just the corner of a uniform, a hand on a shoulder. She closed it again. Outside, the wind battered the frame of the car, whining like it wanted in. Rachel had prepared for everything, except for the failure of the machine she trusted most. She hadn't planned to be found. That's when she saw the headlights. Twin beams emerging like eyes through the red veil, slow and steady. The crunch of tires on gravel echoed unnaturally in the hollow air as a battered pickup pulled up behind her, engine humming low, defiant against the wind. She stepped out as the truck door opened. The driver was tall, with broad shoulders that suggested a history of carrying too much. His work shirt was gray, sun-bleached along the seams. His face was lean, half hidden beneath a weathered cap, but his eyes were sharp. Familiar in a way that memory hadn't caught up with yet. Clint George didn't waste words. He rarely did. People in Fairfield knew him as the mechanic who fixed more than just engines. The kind of man who never asked for thanks. Who showed up, did the work, and left. There were stories, about a limp that never healed right, about scars down his back and a chest that caught the sunlight wrong. But no one in town asked. And he didn't tell. He nodded once at Rachel and walked to the front of her car. She followed, watching as he lifted the hood like it was muscle memory. His hands were scarred, precise, and patient. He checked the obvious first: battery, connections, ignition coil. Then he paused. Something didn't belong. There, nestled beside the fuse relay, was a small black box wired directly into the engine harness. It wasn't automotive. It wasn't even civilian. The casing was steel, matte black, with a faint white stencil, 3 wings spiraling around a trident. Not a manufacturer's logo. A symbol that whispered of classified deployments, of tech not spoken about in polite company. Clint's body tensed. He traced the wire backward, noting how cleanly it had been installed, integrated like a parasite. The work of someone with military experience, possibly intelligence. He had seen similar devices before, long ago. Not under a car hood, but inside armored transport, near jamming systems, and drone uplinks. He stepped back slightly, wiping dust from his brow, when something else caught his eye. Rachel had moved closer to the front of the car. The wind tugged at the collar of her jacket, revealing a silver chain around her neck. Hanging from it was a dog tag, worn, the text nearly faded. He leaned just enough to read it. And then the world narrowed. The name was etched deep into memory. A name he hadn't spoken in over a decade. It sat on his tongue now like metal. That name had been whispered into a blood-slick radio in a different desert, under fire. It had been screamed during a medevac extraction gone wrong. It had been mourned, he thought, buried beneath sand and silence. He stared at the tag, then at her. Rachel Morris. She didn't recognize him, yet. Or perhaps she did, and chose not to reveal it. He stepped back further, breath caught in his throat. His eyes, once scanning the engine for mechanical answers, now traced the lines of her face. Her features were familiar, but older, more defined by whatever years had carved into her. He remembered the last time he saw her, kneeling over him, her voice calm in the chaos. Her hands, steady and bloodied, had closed his wound. He'd felt the heat of the fire behind them. Heard the dying groans of comrades. Watched her give up her own body armor to stop his bleeding. And then, blackness. When he woke, they told him she hadn't made it out. They told him she was gone. He never questioned it. Too many ghosts to keep track of, and too many scars to dig through. But now, in the middle of a storm in Arizona, here she was. Standing next to the same car that carried a military-grade lockbox under its hood. Her name around her neck. Her silence louder than any scream. Clint took one step back, suddenly unsure whether this was a breakdown or the start of something else entirely. Then he heard the sound. Engines. Not one, but several. The kind that hum low, armored, and indifferent to storms. Dark shapes emerged from the orange dust. And in that moment, Clint realized he hadn't stumbled onto an accident. He had walked into something buried. Something forgotten. Or worse, something that had never really ended. The engines grew louder, low and synchronized, like thunder that refused to fade. Through the veil of dust, 3 black SUVs emerged, their surfaces matte and clean despite the storm, as though untouched by the world around them. They fanned out without hesitation, forming a half-circle around the sedan and Clint's truck. Doors opened in unison. No words. No shouts. Just movement, precise and practiced. Men stepped out in tailored black suits, their silhouettes rigid. Their boots sank slightly into the sand but never faltered. Their eyes were hidden behind dark lenses, though the storm rendered them nearly useless. Still, they wore them. Because men like these didn't rely on sight alone. They carried presence like a we*P*N. One walked toward Clint. He moved like someone used to being obeyed, the wind parting slightly as if it, too, respected his purpose. His suit didn't wrinkle, not even in this chaos. His earpiece buzzed faintly, and a small lapel pin glinted silver before disappearing under his jacket. No name tag. No agency badge. Just the kind of authority that didn't need one. "Mr. George," he said, his voice barely audible over the storm, but unmistakably confident. Clint didn't answer. He kept his eyes on Rachel, who hadn't moved. Her posture was tense, but not afraid. She seemed to be waiting. Expecting them. "You've stumbled into something classified," the man continued. "We need you to step back." Clint didn't move. Dust swirled around him. The kind that coated skin and stayed under fingernails for weeks. It brought back memories, different uniforms, different deserts. The kind of dust that used to mix with blood. Rachel finally looked at Clint. Their eyes met. There was a flicker, recognition, maybe apology. Or perhaps it was just fatigue. A silent admission of truths too tangled to speak out loud. Another SUV arrived, larger than the others, towing a matte gray trailer marked only with an emblem, a winged hourglass inside a triangle. Not official. Not public. The kind of marking that disappeared in reports and never showed up on news feeds. Men in dark fatigues unloaded equipment. Laptops, portable antennas, a folding table. The sedan's hood was closed and scanned. Someone examined the lockbox with a device that emitted a green pulse. The wind howled louder, but the operation proceeded as if under glass. Clint watched it all, unmoving. He wasn't afraid. But something inside him had shifted. A pressure behind his eyes. A name echoing in the back of his mind, over and over again. He had seen this choreography before, years ago, under fire. When mistakes were buried with medals. When silence was currency. Then came the final vehicle. It rolled in slow, deliberately, a black command SUV with darkened windows and reinforced plates. Its presence silenced even the storm for a moment. The door opened, and a man stepped out. His uniform was crisp, untouched by the grit swirling around them. A high-ranking officer. Medals gleamed across his chest like echoes of dead men. His eyes scanned the scene, not with urgency, but with the precision of someone ticking through a list. Clint knew that look. Knew the stance. Knew the tone of a man who had seen too much and was trying to forget none of it. The officer approached Rachel first. He spoke quietly. Too quietly for Clint to hear. But Rachel nodded once and handed him the chain from her neck. Her fingers lingered on it a second longer than necessary. Then, without a word, she stepped back. Clint's breath caught. The officer turned toward him. "Staff Sergeant George," he said. Clint hadn't heard that title in years. Not since the field hospital. Not since he was declared dead on paper and left in a blur of red tape and discharged promises. He nodded, slowly. "We didn't expect you to be here," the officer continued. Clint said nothing. A tablet was handed to the officer. He tapped through files, then turned the screen toward Clint. It showed grainy footage, thermal images, timestamps from a decade ago. A firefight in a tight canyon. A burning convoy. And one figure dragging another through the dirt. Rachel. Dragging him. A female medic, backlit by flames, applying pressure to a wound while returning fire with one hand. And in her other, the same dog tag Clint had seen an hour ago. His voice broke the silence for the first time. "They said she died." The officer nodded grimly. She was presumed dead. But after what happened at the extraction point, things got complicated. Her clearance level, the nature of that mission, she vanished into a compartment of operations even we didn't fully control. Clint's jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists at his sides, sand crusting in the grooves of his knuckles. "You let her disappear. She chose it. For your protection. For hers." Clint looked at Rachel again. She had returned to the side of her car, arms crossed, head slightly bowed. Not ashamed. Just exhausted. The officer stepped closer. "We're not here to harm you. Or her. We're here to make sure this," he gestured to the vehicle, to the box, to the circle of black SUVs, "doesn't fall into the wrong hands." "What is it?" Clint asked. The officer's silence was answer enough. They were standing on the edge of something buried deep. And Clint understood now that his appearance here wasn't coincidence. "You were saved by someone who was never supposed to exist," the officer said quietly. "Now she's reappeared. And so have you." He turned and walked away, offering no orders, no threats. Clint remained still. The storm began to lighten. He felt the weight of his name again. Not the one they printed on awards or stitched into fatigues, but the one spoken in whispers among those who knew what it meant to carry someone else's life in your hands. He looked at Rachel. And she looked back. There was nothing left to say. Only the sound of the wind easing across the highway. Only the blinking of hazard lights, still defying the dusk. The storm passed slowly, like a curtain reluctantly drawn open. The wind softened, dust settling like powdered memory across the vehicles and their occupants. Clint remained still beside his truck, boots buried in desert grit, watching the final details of the command post unfold. The men in suits now operated with less urgency, as if the greatest danger had already passed. But Clint knew better. The real danger had never been the storm, nor the lockbox, it was memory. What it could stir. What it could expose. One of the agents approached him quietly. He carried a folder, not a tablet, not a screen, but paper. Clint took it without a word. Inside were a few grainy photographs, a service report, and a commendation letter printed in black ink on thick cardstock. The words at the top stopped him cold. Bronze Star Medal, Staff Sergeant Clinton R. George. He blinked. The date was familiar, 12 years ago, the same operation. The mission they never discussed. The mission that ended with blood, smoke, and radio silence. Clint looked up. I never received this. The agent nodded. It was issued. But redirected. At the request of your commanding officer. After your presumed death, well, the bureaucracy doesn't like contradiction. The words felt like ash in Clint's mouth. And then he saw it, tucked behind the letter, a flash drive sealed in a plastic pouch. A note was attached in clear, military handwriting. Footage, FOB Vega, September 27, 13, medic field camera. His hands felt heavy as he inserted the drive into a field laptop offered by the agent. The screen flickered, then opened into a series of clips. Body camera footage, raw and shaky. Fire cracked through the speakers. Screams in the background. Medics yelling coordinates, ducking behind transport vehicles. And then, her. Rachel. Younger, but unmistakable. Her uniform was stained dark, her face streaked with sweat and dirt. She was crouched beside a downed soldier, Clint, his torso wrapped in makeshift gauze. She barked orders at the camera holder, then looked directly into the lens. We do not leave him. She tore off her own vest, used it to stabilize Clint's wound, and wrapped the dog tags around his wrist. He was slipping in and out of consciousness, his mouth moving but no sound recorded. Then she dragged him, half-crawled with him, across a field of broken bodies and burning equipment. Clint closed the laptop. He remembered none of it. Only the pain. The smell of burning fuel. And the unbearable weight of survival. The agent stepped back respectfully. Clint understood the gesture. He had just been handed proof of a ghost's sacrifice, a sacrifice that had never been honored. Until now. At the edge of the makeshift command post, Rachel stood beneath the softening sky, her coat drawn tight. She hadn't approached. She hadn't needed to. What had passed between them didn't require conversation. But Clint walked toward her. Each step felt heavier than the last. When he reached her, he held out the chain. The dog tag glinted faintly, still warm from his hand. She took it without speaking. I saw the footage, he said finally, voice like gravel. Rachel nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon. They were going to leave you, she said. And you didn't, he replied. The space between them was thick with years. 12 of them, lost in the gray corners of bureaucracy and misclassified files. For a moment, Clint wanted to ask where she'd been, what she'd seen, how she'd survived being erased. But he didn't. Because he saw it in her face. The quiet tremble behind her eyes. The stoicism that cost too much to maintain. One of the black SUVs pulled forward. The same officer from earlier exited again and walked toward Clint. There's been a review, he said, opening a small leather box. Inside was a military service coin. Gold edge, midnight blue enamel, engraved with Clint's name and Rachel's initials. The symbol of a joint recognition, the kind rarely issued. The kind not available to the public. Clint took it slowly. For exceptional conduct under fire, the officer added. For saving lives. And for surviving when no one expected you to. He turned to Rachel. And for re-emerging when the system would have preferred silence. Rachel took the second coin handed to her, identical in every way. The officer stepped back. No speech. No ceremony. But Clint noticed the details. Every agent now stood still. Heads slightly bowed. Not out of regulation. Out of respect. Rachel looked up at him, her fingers tracing the edge of the coin. This isn't about medals, she said softly. No, Clint replied. It's about being remembered. Later that evening, Clint was driven back to his truck. The road had been cleared. The storm was gone. Only dust remained, settled, quiet. He drove back toward Fairfield, the sun dipping behind the low mesas. Rachel followed behind in a military vehicle, now assigned to escort duty, not out of suspicion, but honor. By the time he pulled into the gravel lot of his garage, the sky was deep violet. The town looked the same. But it wasn't. Not anymore. He unlocked the door, flicked on the old fluorescent lights, and stepped inside. Everything smelled like oil, rubber, and steel. But there, on the workbench, someone had left a single item. A folded American flag. And beneath it, a photograph, grainy, but unmistakable. Clint and Rachel. A desert sunrise behind them. The last moment before everything changed. For the first time in over a decade, Clint sat down at his bench. He didn't reach for a wrench. He didn't need to fix anything tonight. Because something broken had already started to mend. Back in Fairfield, the town moved slowly, like a place unsure of how to react to what had happened. No news stories were published. No official statements were made. The black SUVs had vanished before morning, leaving behind only faint tire tracks and a rumor too strange for small-town mouths to fully trust. But something had shifted, subtle, like the way wind changes before the weather does. Clint George returned to his modest life with little fanfare. The garage opened at 8 a.m. sharp the next day. The same cracked vinyl stool waited behind the counter. The coffee maker sputtered as always, filling the air with the comforting bitterness of burnt grounds. But people noticed. They came by in slow, hesitant waves, locals who hadn't visited the shop in years. Some brought their cars. Some brought questions. Most brought silence, the kind that lingers when you've realized someone you thought you knew was more than he let on. Rachel didn't leave. She found a room above the old hardware store, paying in cash. Officially, she didn't exist. But every morning at 7:45, a pickup would pull into the gravel lot behind the garage. She'd step out, holding 2 coffees. She'd hand one to Clint, then settle on the bench just outside the service bay. She never wore her tags. She never brought up the past. They rarely spoke at all. People watched, of course. In towns like Fairfield, stillness is as loud as a siren. The sight of her, sharp eyes, military posture, civilian clothes, raised questions, murmured speculation. But no one confronted her. Maybe it was the way Clint would glance her way every so often, not protectively, but with a kind of steady reassurance that dared anyone to treat her as anything but equal. In time, the story emerged, not through gossip, but through presence. Someone from the town council left a card under Clint's office door, an invitation to speak at the annual Veterans Day gathering in the park. He declined, of course. But on the morning of the event, he showed up anyway. Not on the stage. Just at the edge of the crowd, leaning against the fender of his truck. Rachel stood beside him, arms crossed, her eyes scanning the trees like she was still on patrol. The mayor spotted them and nodded once. She stepped off the platform mid-sentence and walked straight to them. No speech. No microphone. Just a folded paper and a plaque. She handed them both to Clint in front of the entire town. And for a moment, everyone stopped talking. The plaque read simply, "For valor beyond orders, Staff Sergeant Clint George and Medic Rachel Morris. In honor of service unseen." It was the first time Rachel's name had been printed anywhere official in over a decade. They didn't smile. They didn't pose for photographs. But they stood there long enough for the truth to settle over the gathered crowd like dust. In the weeks that followed, something unusual began to happen. People came to the garage, not just for repairs, but for something quieter. They brought their old war medals, their faded photos, their unspoken grief. Veterans who had never talked. Widows who had never asked questions. A teenager whose father had died in the same conflict Clint and Rachel had survived. They all came, drawn by the gravity of something that had nothing to do with engines or oil filters. One afternoon, a woman in her 70s left behind a box without a note. Inside it was a dog tag and a letter, yellowed with age. It belonged to her brother, Kia in Fallujah. She wrote that he'd spoken about a medic once. A woman who patched him up under fire and stayed behind to save another soldier. She hadn't known her name until now. Clint read the letter aloud to Rachel. She said nothing, but later he found her sitting in the back room, holding the tag in her palm like a stone pulled from a riverbed, smoothed by time, but never weightless. By spring, Rachel had started fixing cars too. Not for money. Just the simpler jobs, brake lines, belts, tires. She worked with quiet precision, like someone rebuilding more than machinery. Clint didn't offer thanks. He just handed her the right tools when she needed them. Then came the school visit. The local history teacher brought in his class for a field trip. He said he wanted to teach them something about resilience. Rachel stood behind the workbench as the kids filed in, their sneakers squeaking on the concrete. She said a few words. Nothing rehearsed. Nothing grand. Just that sometimes, the strongest thing a person can do is show up again. Day after day. Even when the world forgets your name. When they left, one girl had drawn a picture. It showed Clint's truck, the garage, and two stick figures drinking coffee. She wrote beneath it, "Thank you for being brave even when no one saw." Clint taped it above the register. On the 1-year mark, someone organized a town gathering at the garage. Clint didn't want a celebration. Rachel didn't want to be seen. But they showed up. Because by then, the garage had become something more. The mayor spoke. The pastor said a prayer. But the most powerful moment came in silence, when a young man stepped forward in a military uniform and handed Clint a coin. No words. Just a gesture. He was the younger brother of one of the men saved during that mission 12 years ago. He had joined the service because of that story. Because of what Rachel had done. Clint placed the coin on a shelf, next to the folded flag. Rachel added the old photograph beside it. That corner of the garage became a quiet place of remembrance. Not a shrine. Just a small space where kindness, courage, and sacrifice lived without applause. By the time summer rolled in, the garage had more work than ever. Not because of advertising. Because of trust. People came for tune-ups and left with something else. Clint and Rachel never told their full story. They didn't need to. It was written in the silence they shared. In the steady hands that kept fixing broken things. In the people who now saw them, not as ghosts, not as myths, but as reminders that even when systems forget, even when names disappear, dignity endures. Some mornings, Clint still sat alone before the garage opened, coffee cooling beside him. And he would think about that desert storm. About the blinking hazard lights. About how close everything came to being lost for good. But then the bell above the garage door would chime, and Rachel would enter with 2 fresh cups of coffee. They never said much. They didn't have to. Because sometimes, the most important rescue doesn't happen in battle. It happens after. When someone shows up again. And stays.